Walk to Moon Summary by Sophia Ibarwin. This story is about a girl named Salamanica Treehiddle, but her friends call her Sal. Sal is on a road trip with her grandparents, traveling from Euclid, Ohio to Lewiston, Idaho, to see her mother because her birthday is approaching. Past the time on this very long trip, Sal begins to tell her grandparents about her new life in the city. She moved there from Bybanks, Kentucky, because her mother left her father and he couldn't stand the farm they lived on because it reminded him of her so much. They moved to Euclid, Ohio because of a friend her father had there. Her name was Mrs. Cadaver. Mrs. Cadaver and her father spent a lot of time together, and Sal didn't like her. During the course of the road trip, she begins to tell her grandparents about her new friend, Phoebe Winterbottom. Phoebe is Sal's best friend, whose mother had just left her. During the course of the story, Phoebe tries to figure out why her mother left her, and Sal feels compelled to help her because her own mother had left her, and she knew what Phoebe was going through. Phoebe thinks that Mrs. Cadaver has something to do with her mother's disappearance, and the mysterious notes that have been appearing on her family's doorsteps, and the strange boy who Phoebe has dubbed the lunatic, who appears at her house one day. Sal finds herself in the middle of Phoebe's problems, and during this time in the story, she finds herself falling for Ben Finley, who is Mary Lou Finley's cousin, and goes to school with them all. Sal notices Ben is trying to kiss her, but every time he attempts, he misses and ends up kissing her earlobe or her shoulder. By this time, Sal is at the point in the story where she figures out why Mrs. Winterbottom disappears and her grandparents stop in South Dakota, and they end up swimming there in a river. A boy approaches them and he tells them that the area in the river where they were swimming was private property, and when her grandfather discusses this with him, her grandmother was suddenly bitten by a poisonous water moccasin, and the boy begins to suck the poison from her grandmother's leg, and when they arrive at the hospital, she must spend the night. Then the next morning, they were allowed to leave. Even though she's recovered, her health begins to falter, and she begins to feel very sick. When they're back on the road, Sal begins to tell her story again about the day that Phoebe's mother suddenly disappeared, and she tells the story, and she begins to remember the day when she was in the forest and she fell from a tree, and her pregnant mother had to carry her back to the house. Later, her mother gave birth later that night to a dead child, and to overcome her grief and sorrow, she goes to visit her cousin in Lewiston, Ohio, to overcome her grief and sorrow. And during this point in her story, Sal realizes that they're taking the same path her mother did. Her story about Phoebe's family, Phoebe becomes more and more upset as the days go by and her mother doesn't turn up. And finally, Sal and Phoebe rush to the police department with some evidence that Phoebe found, and they demand to see the police sergeant. And when they do, he talks to them for a short while, and then he leaves for an hour, and he returns with Phoebe's father, and he takes them home. While Sal was at the police station, she discovered that the lunatic was Sergeant Bickle's son. At this point in her story, her grandparents and Sal arrive at Yellowstone National Forest, and they stop to see Old Faithful, and they stay for the night in the motel, and they discover that her grandmother is not well. Sal resumes her story. Sal and Phoebe locate the lunatic to a nearby college campus, and what they discover there is horrifying, because they see Phoebe's mother, Mrs. Winterbottom, arm in arm with the lunatic, and she gives him a kiss on the cheek. Sal becomes overwhelmed and she runs away. When she stops running, she finds herself at a nearby mental hospital, to her surprise, where she finds Ben. They talk, and then they share their first kiss with each other. Mrs. Winterbottom arrives home a few days later, and she tells her family that the lunatic is actually her son that she had prior to marrying Mr. Winterbottom, but she could not care for him and she gave him up for adoption. At this point in Sal's story, her grandparents and her reach Coraline, and her grandmother goes into the hospital because she becomes very, very sick. Sal has to continue this journey on her own, and then she reaches an overpass where a man tells her that a bus went over that ridge 1 year prior and that there was only one survivor. Then the sergeant found her car, and he took her to see her mother, but he took her to see a grave, and it turned out to be her mother's grave, and she realized her mother didn't leave her father. She died in the bus crash 1 year ago, and that Mrs. Cadaver was the only survivor, and that she sat with her mother those few days before. Then her father and her moved back to Kentucky, and they went back to their farm, and that was the end of Walk Two Moons.